everyone. This is the Stony Brook University College of Arts and Sciences preview session. I'm Amanda Mills, Assistant Director of Admissions for Stony Brook, and just a few housekeeping notes as we begin. You may use the Q&A feature to ask our speaker any questions, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. Also note that this session will be recorded and available on the admissions YouTube page later this week. Today's session, titled On Love, Data and Technologies Rooted in Care, is going to be presented by Stephanie Dinkins, Professor of Art at Stony Brook. Welcome, Professor Dinkins. It's all yours.
Wow, thank you, Amanda. It's so great to be here. I'm happy to be a part of preview sessions. And hey, everyone out there, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my practice and what we're thinking about here in the art department at Stony Brook. Thinking a lot about, art in far-reaching technologies and the future, doing that in my general efforts as a professor, and also as the director of the Future History Studio, which I started this year on campus. So let me tell you a little bit about who I am and what I do, and I'll show you some images so you can get a sense for that. And then if you have any questions after that, we can talk about them. So here we go. Let's give a share screen quickly. Right, share sound, share screen. Yeah, so as we said, my name is Stephanie Dinkins. It's not all that important. I think the things that are important is that I'm an artist, and really I'm an artist who started off as a photographer. So I'm a photographer who is now looking at artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies, far-reaching technologies that are forming the future. And you might wonder, like, how did a photographer get to AI, right? How do you become the person who's dealing with AI? Well, for me, it's all about this robot that you see me sitting with. So this is me, the human here, and Bina 48, which is an emotionally endowed robot that the Terrorism Movement Foundation is working to transfer consciousness from a person or a small group of people into this robot so that they can make this thing that can go on in perpetuity and kind of carry on the thoughts and life and emotions of the person, Bina Rothblatt, it is based on. I first encountered this robot, and there we are at a conference together on YouTube. And I was really floored by the robot itself, because it's pretty amazing to sit in front of a robot. And as a Black woman, I hadn't seen that many Black women robots. So I was really curious about what this thing was, where it came from, and why it existed, and really who's funding it. So as I said before, it's the Terrorism Movement Foundation who's funding it. And then I asked them if I could meet the robot, and clearly I had a chance to meet it. And once I met it, I wanted to become its friend. So I started a project, and this is really in a lot of ways just a documentary photography project, where I had conversations with Bina 48 and I would record them. And I was trying to become her friend and figure out what that thing was all about. And from talking to Bina 48, which really means, like, I would go to Vermont and sit in front of this robot and ask it questions. Sometimes it would answer, sometimes it wouldn't. Sometimes we would be at odds with each other because it wanted to talk about the singularity and transfer of consciousness. And I wanted to talk about things like family, love, and race. And so we were at odds. And talking to the robot did for me was make me think a lot about what the technological future was going to look like, especially for folks of color who are not necessarily the ones who are programming a lot of the far-reaching technologies that we are encountering and will further encounter as we go forward. And really what I came to the conclusion of is that we're at the start of an epoch that is completely changing the way we live, work, love, and remember. And as the world is constructed through algorithms and big data, we have to find ways to ensure that the AI systems in particular that we encounter, right? So in the AI systems that are all around us, from our phones to medical systems that help diagnose us, to the justice system that says who gets to go to jail and for how long in many cases, that they understand us and have like real intrinsic self-determined pictures of a myriad of communities. So not just one community, like the community that's making that. And then you might think about Silicon Valley or other kind of bastions of research where people are doing research on these things, but they're often homogeneous sets of folks. And really what I'm talking about is they're often groups of white men for the most part. And the question is, how do we start to form our world so that it just does not reflect their aims, but reflects all of our aims? And my solution to that, my thought about that, especially through encounters with Bina 48, is by engaging the technology, even though I'm often told that the technology is something that is hard and maybe I don't have access to, and then trying to change it in whatever way, shape, or form I can. For example, in this instance, this is me sitting with the real Bina Rothblatt with Bina 48 behind us. So the real person, Bina Rothblatt, is the primary influence on the intelligence of Bina 48. And asking her questions about race that I felt were really left out of the robot, or that the robot had a sense of, racial ethics in itself and ideas of racism that were bad, but it didn't have deep experience and it wasn't expressing the things in the ways that I felt like my community really experienced them. And I thought that was kind of dangerous, right? So I got to sit down with Bina Rothblatt and interview her. And through those interviews were then added to the robot so that there was a more nuanced story of the way that Bina 48 and Bina Rothblatt could express ideas of race and what it means to walk through the world as a Black woman, right? And so that project really set me off on this long-term exploration of these technologies. This was a first for me. Started in 2014, and I've been doing work around this ever since. And in fact, the next project after that was called Not the Only One. And this is my project where I tried to make a voice interactive artificial intelligence, kind of like Bina 48, but without the robotic body, that tells the story of the multi-generational story of an American family. And in fact, what it's doing is trying to tell the story of my family. So what this really is a chatbot that's been informed by the data and oral histories from my particular family. And really it's 3 generations of women in the family who have informed this thing. And then it goes out into the public, through exhibitions and tries to communicate. I will say that it's not something that's very fluid. I've managed to make this very wonky object that is a sculpture that will talk to you, but isn't very communicative in certain ways and is very communicative in other ways. And let me explain that the whole thing is based on these oral histories first, and then I'll come back to something, right? So we just interviewed each other. The 3 generations, the 3 women, we talked to each other, we interviewed each other. And I use that as the data for my chatbot. The problem with doing that is that really we don't have enough data to make a really robust example of a chatbot. But I kind of insist that we stay with our limited data because a lot of the systems that I was asked to build on top of, right? So when you make this kind of chatbot, what you're usually doing is you have a set of algorithms that you work with or an algorithmic system that you work with, and it's informed by data, but you need a lot of it, right? If you think about something like Google or Amazon and the kind of data that they use or have at their disposal, it's tons. It's all of our data coming in and being used. And most of the time, or a lot of the time for such chatbots, people will use things like the Reddit data set, which I did not want to base my family history on, or even something called the Cornell movie data set, which is a dialogic, right, data set. So you have a data set that has a lot of Q&A or people answering questions that I didn't want to base my family data on either, because the history of American movies is not very supportive of Black life and being Blackness in this country, right? So to base your family's history atop that felt really wrong to me. So it always come to this point where I'm trying to build this thing and I'm using information that doesn't quite suit the task at hand. And so instead of just building on what's available, which many people do, and actually the data sets that I just mentioned are data sets that many researchers will use or grab, or people making projects will use and grab and just base their projects on them and keep going. And I find that difficult, right? Because I'm trying to think of how we really preserve what it means to be a kind of Black family that was striving and has a very particular ethos, and have that ethos come in and not be kind of crafted by general language, right? And I really think of this as oral history as the data, as it's an act of social resistance and preservation of the family. So I'm being really careful about how I use and disseminate data, and where it goes. For instance, Not the Only One is based on a closed system, so that you know, we don't go on the internet, because that would do something again. The only way place it does touch other things is when people talk to it. That data is incorporated to the project because it goes in and gets trained back through. But through Not the Only One, which you can see comes in this form of this Ernie thing with 3 faces on it, I'm trying to think about, what do machine learning or AI systems created by and for a community look like? What are the perils of systems created for, but not by a community, right? So, you know, if Google makes a system that we are all working on, and a general use system, that's fine. But what happens when you use very particular data that is representative of those that you love and want to care for? How does it change the equation? And then how can oral history and small data help break the mold of big data collection? And we all know, like, that every time we use our phones, or every time we answer a questionnaire in particular, that data is being collected and used in different ways, sometimes to sell us things, sometimes for much more nefarious purposes. But how do we, like, start to think about how to impact that big data so that it is more nuanced, and can be empowering processes for communities. And when I say communities, I'm usually thinking from the perspective of my particular community, but really this, I think, applies to any community that isn't a part of the hegemonic norm, right? How do we preserve those small things about who and what we are, and what connects us, and what makes us somewhat different? How do we preserve those things in a system? How do we keep that a part of the cultural memory of who and what we are as a human family, right? And so I've been talking about small data, and this is like having data that's meaningful, that's organized by community, that's accessible, understandable, which is a whole other question, and actionable. How do we get our systems to understand the value of small data and use it, as opposed to gobbling up all the data and homogenizing us? I think of it as homogenizing us into lowest common denominator definitions of humanity. So this is just me. Whoops, let's go back to that. Hold on, let's go back. This is me talking to Not the Only One a little bit. Let's see if she'll play now. Go. Why? Oh, I keep doing that. Sorry, people. Why do you exist?
The way.
The way to what?
I'm gonna be a little bit of a lot of things.
Good for you. Why do you exist?
I am about broad engagement and attracting people to the AI space who might not be there otherwise. I am trying to model different ways of creating AI. I encourage people who think that they are not a part of the technological future to get involved.
So in that clip, you hear me talking to Not the Only One, and 2 kinds of answers. One that is something that Not the Only One, that the chatbot comes up with on its own. That's the way. It's kind of a nonsensical answer to a question, although you could argue that it's not exactly nonsensical. And I feel that, like, the algorithm is kind of taking all the information it has, really percolating it, and then coming up with the best answer it possibly can. And then the second answer, which is a prepared answer. So you ask a very particular question, why do you exist? It has a preformed answer. And I find that the least compelling bit of research here, because, you know, we could do this and make this thing very straightforward, where people would ask it specific questions, it would give answers that people would kind of be satisfied with, but that's not about a kind of growth and feeling the ethos of a family. It's more about just regurgitating information. And the projects, and actually all of my projects are about questioning systems and seeing what's possible for them. For example, for me, the best thing that Not the Only One has ever said is take it to the would-be. And this is something it came up with on its own in answer to a question that I had asked it. And I love it because in that answer, I hear echoes of my grandmother and the way she would use kind of metaphors to get you to think about things instead of telling you something straightforward. And so I know that this thing is starting to pick up somewhat of the ethos and ideas of the family, even if it is kind of in hard to decipher ways. And what this project is really about is the statement that I found from Amiri Baraka from 1970. And so pointing to that is also pointing to these cycles of us kind of waking up to trying to shape our world in certain ways and seeing what's possible. So Amiri Baraka wrote, machines, as Norbert Wiener said, are an extension of their inventor creators. That's not simple once you think. Machines, the entire technology of the West is just that, the technology of the West. Nothing has to look or function the way it does. That's the really important part for me. The West man's freedom, unscientifically got at the expense of the rest of the world's people, has allowed him to expand his mind, spread his sensibility wherever it could go, and so shape the world and its powerful artifact engines. So my question that comes out of that is, well, how do we each kind of look at these technologies that for a lot of us seem out of our purview, right? And then influence them and shape the world in ways that we feel that will be supportive of us. And this is where I start to think about what data and love have to do with each other, right? How do we really start to mold the systems to care for the communities we care for? And I would argue that molding to care for the communities we care for helps to paint a broader, bigger picture so that the systems care in better, more nuanced, more informed ways for all of us, right? Okay, so let's see, I'm going to skip a little bit. This is not the only one in an upcoming iteration where she becomes a very representational model. And actually, you know, I'm excited about this because I want to see how people will respond to this thing in a form that is something they know versus a weird sculpture. And I will say that when people see the sculpture, they're very generous and grace and full of grace for the thing and patient with the thing. So I wonder what will happen when she is an object that looks like a human. We're going to go here and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about other people who are trying to shape, right, and form things so that they care for the communities they care for. So this is an art project by an artist called Pretty Dark, and it's an open source Afro hair library. And so Pretty Dark is trying to get all these different forms of Black hair for people made so that people who are making 3D projects have hair that feel good and intrinsic and usable for Black characters. And this is important because it's really hard to find Black hair. And in fact, that image of Not the Only One I just showed you, we spent months and months and months trying to develop the hair that felt good to Black viewers, right? That felt good to us, that it does things that we know. So she's making this repository that people can contribute to so that there's a library so that there is not this dearth anymore. This is Alice Shepard, who is also known as Wheelchair Dancer, the person in the wheelchair on the bottom. They were trying to make some VR pieces for, you know, motion capture for VR or AR. And what was really interesting was she was working with people who were disabled. And as they put the motion capture suits and went in the software always tried to fix their bodies, right? So the software tried to make their bodies more normal. And you know, that's a whole community that we have these technologies that we work with that don't understand something of difference, a large population of difference. And the question is, how do we start to make it so that these technologies love all of us, right? Across constituencies, across communities, enough to capture us how we are, where we are, not what we should be in some optimized version, right? And so people who are working with systems and trying to capture things that are outside of the norm or that are often ignored because they're not the prevalent form or format. And this is Lajane Mcmillan, who is an artist who is archiving data, movement data, right? So she's archiving Black movement and again, creating an archive or a repository of movements that are very particular and saving them and using them in projects so that you can go forward. And this is the kind of work that a lot of people are starting to do, where they're trying to preserve the ways that their communities work within the world, so that they can be better represented in these spaces that are virtual. And as we know, we're getting towards more and more virtual spaces where you know, a lot of our lives, like we've heard of the metaverse, Web 3.0, where we're starting to think about what it is to live, excuse me, to live in a virtual environment, right? And so my answer to this question of like, how do we start to mold the world into something that recognizes us? And that's a big us, right? No matter who we are, I feel like we have nuances that we want to preserve, or maybe cultural specificities that we want to preserve. So I started this project called Binary Calculations Are Inadequate to Assess Us. That's a title. And it's an art project. It's really a website and a phone app that are trying to, well, let's read it, right? That ask how we can make our technological systems, and these are systems that control our governments, our relationships, our institutions, more caring, right? That are becoming more and more ubiquitous around them. So if they are around us, right, don't we want them to, instead of being punitive, instead of just watching us, care for us, making sure that they have a space and understand what it means to support and get things done from a stance of love and care, rather than what we can take away, how we can be punitive, how we can catch you doing something. And it's based on this idea that much data and wide use, so these data sets that people use to kind of build systems, is inadequate, meaning they don't have enough images of people of color. They don't have enough, you know, ways of speaking and using language that can recognize a multiplicity of communities. So they're not competent to really assess or support most on the planet. And what do we do about that? My idea is that we start making our own databases that describe things in more broad, nuanced terms. And the best way I can describe this is something I call the wedding dress problem, right? So if you Google wedding dress, especially here in the West, the thing that you are most likely going to come up with is this white wedding dress that we see on the left or right? But the typical white wedding dress. When in fact, each of these images is a wedding dress. So there's a Ghanaian wedding dress and there is a Indian red sari wedding dress. And the question that I have is, how do we get our systems, our algorithmic systems, to recognize these things equally as a wedding dress, right? How do we recognize all these things instead of saying this one thing is the thing and the others are kind of subgenres, which is not necessarily true. And my solution to that problem, as I said, is this app. So you can go on the Apple App Store or Google Play Store and download a BCAI, this app that will ask questions of you and ask you to donate your data. And it will also talk to you about your privacy and what happens when you generally provide data to whoever, or when your data is collected, whether with your knowledge or not. And right, we start with simple things like how do you, well, maybe this isn't simple at all. How do you define care? Like, what does it mean to care, especially if we're thinking about a society of care? How should we think about that? How should we define it? What would make it work well for most people on the planet? right? And so there's this app thinking about our algorithmic ecosystem and how we as citizens can inform it with better data. For example, if I am someone who wears a Ghanaian wedding dress, I want to provide a definition in what that looks like for a system so that it can then start to recognize that. And as I said, it's talking about your privacy as well. And we're asking, let's see if we can go here, asking questions that is like, can we create data sets of care and generosity? And to my mind, creating a data set of care and generosity is creating a system of care. And the way we're getting at this very particularly is to ask people, hey, upload an image that illustrates close attention, concern, or responsibility in any way you see fit. So we're asking people, take a picture or upload a picture that you have and tell us why it illustrates this idea of care. And when you do that, you're labeling an image with ideas that are particular to you and your community, right? How do you care for Black women? That's a question for all of us. And then what questions should we be asking others donating data? So what should we be asking? We are just a small team who made this app. So we want to know what you think we should be asking to inform the greater systems that we are all a part of better and deeper, right? And here are the QR codes if you wanted to download the app, and a nod to my collaborators. This project was made, as you can see, with a team of people, and I have to say that working in this team was wonderful because we had all these deep conversations about data, and we're all from different communities, and what it means to our community and why, whether we want to contribute or not, and why, and how we think these things can function. And I think the project is valuable right there. But then once we start to involve others, we'll see what grows, because over time, we're going to take in this data and then we're going to create data sets, right, for use for researchers, one that is for images, so that if you want to do something that is image-based, you can download this hyper nuanced version of an image data set, or in one that is for languages, so that if you want to work with language, you have, as I have, right, with not the only one, you have a data set that is reflective of many communities in a very particular way versus general language. This is not the only one. I'm sorry, this is binary calculations as an installation. So we kind of show the website and then put it in a voting booth, because I think in a way this is us kind of voting and registering our votes about the things around us, to craft, ways of going forward. And really all of this makes me think about these ideas of code, practices, craft, and ancestral technology. And I like to think of it this way because I'm trying to encourage, through my work and through talks, people who aren't necessarily automatically inclined to work in this area, to start thinking about why they might and how they might, whether that be coding, whether that be just calling out problems. Like, how do you start to engage the system, especially in a world where many of us are often told that we don't have the mathematical chops to work in this area. We don't have the, whatever it is that we don't have to get involved in this. How could we get involved? Because AI data is a space that touches us all. And so I think it's also a space of civic engagement that we all have to find our ways to impact. Otherwise, we're living under a system that does not necessarily know enough about us to work with us. So in terms of technology, as ancestral technology and craft demands care, risk-taking, duration, refinement, flexibility of process, and the conscious application of intelligence. And so stands as a crucial counterpoint to instant answer, push button living. Even if it is at times tacit, automatic, and technology infused, craft holds out the promise of remaining apart from and gaining perspective on the machine. And that's the part I'm really interested in, right? So a craft is something that we can all do, right? Tinkering, I often talk in the way of tinkering, is something that we can all do. As I said up front, I'm a photographer, I'm not a coder. I've been tinkering a lot in code, and I spend a lot of time on computers these days trying to make things that impact these systems. But the question is, what's your in? So if you don't have the math chops to do this, could you be interested enough in a project to do it anyway? Not the only one is an example of that for me. Like, I was very interested in my family's history and use that project as a way to learn more about the history, and then to allow the algorithm to teach us things about ourselves by the way it processed that information. So just finding a way in, a little bit more about binary calculations and what it looked like. And the importance of process is this thing where, so what we're looking at here is an image of something called Imagenet. Imagenet is a very large image data set, right? So you could go online right now and go to Imagenet, and if you want to do a project that needed images that are tagged and labeled for you in some algorithmic system, you could go there and use this data set. This data set is based on another lexical data set called WordNet. And the thing that I have problems with things like Imagenet is like its historical perspective. So the little columns that we're looking here are the ways that Black people are described in Imagenet. And we can see here that there are some deep historical ways of referring to Black people that are outdated within the data set. So there are biases built in, and the biases are not necessarily corrected, they're just in there. And, you know, I always think about this because I don't necessarily believe in erasing history completely, but in accounting for shifts in the way that we think or weighting things so that, you know, the first thing you don't come up with are the kind of common derogatory terms is really important to me. And by comparison, then you see how white person is described. And then you see the last column is Asian, and it didn't have a really good sense of Asianness. It just listed a bunch of different kinds of Asian. And so anything in that data set that is described in terms of its Asianness has to go in terms of its very small subsets. And maybe that's a good thing, but maybe there should be a kind of overarching space. So the question for me is like, how do you influence this so it does a better job at categorizing images that contain images of Black people, right? Or images of Asian people or white people? How do we do the best job possible now in this contemporary time of labeling our data so that it serves us, so that it loves us, right? I'm gonna skip this one today. And I'll say that, you know, I think that systems are doing better jobs of labeling. But then we come to another point. So this, for example, is an image from a site called Unsplash. Unsplash is an image repository. Like if you needed images of something you're looking for, an image, you might go to the site. And I go to the site particularly because it does a pretty good job of providing a variety of images of Black people, right? So I'm often looking for those kinds of images for projects. And so you can see on the bottom of the image is tagged current events, Black mom, okay, great. But then that text on top where it says alt text description. So this is the way that somebody described this image. And it's like the alt text, like if the image didn't show up or if the small categories didn't show up, this is what it would say. It's a grayscale photo of a man and a woman holding drinking glasses. Now, when you look at this image, it's like, what? Like there's a clear disjointedness between this description and what's in the image. And the question for me is, how does this happen? And why does this happen? And what does it mean if data sets contain images like this and then start to be used in other people's systems to describe things, right? And you know what happens in instances like this is like, oh, when images are tagged, often people will hire folks like Mechanical Turks. So people who are paid pennies on the dollar from around the world to kind of label images. And in this case, the only conclusion I can come to is, well, somebody in a cultural context that they clearly don't understand what's in this image and what it's about, wrote this text. I wonder about their grasp of the English language, and I particularly wonder about their understanding of Black culture, right? And by the way that they describe this image. Now, if you imagine this kind of image being labeled exponentially over and over again, incorrectly, or with odd descriptions, what that does for a system that's trying to work and use this to create kind of clear versions of things, right? Trying to recreate images or provide a kind of representation of a people through images if they're this poorly labeled. And if you're interested in such things and want to see what's in data sets that you encounter, you can go to the site, and it's actually a Google site, but it's called Know Your Data, and you can explore what's in a data set or what's in a given data set. And it's interesting to go in and see what images are in a data set and then how they're labeled. And then you can think about, well, is this something I might want to use if you're making something, or it just gives you a kind of cultural context of what's within the data that is describing us for these much larger algorithmic systems that are all around us. And I'm going to tell you how I got here, and then maybe we will leave it there. So the way that I got to this inquiry, especially for binary calculations, was, right around the time of George Floyd, I tried to use something called an image to text GAN. So an AI system that takes a text that you type into the system. So you type in a text. I typed in a Black woman crying. And then it tries to make an image that illustrates that text. And so when I typed in a Black woman crying, and I did this on a system called Runway ML, which is available online, although it's shifting its focus, but you can go and check it out. And it uses a general adversarial network. So it's using kind of images, and they're kind of fighting back and forth to try to come up with an image that expresses what's in the text. But this image is kind of a white figure with a Black cloak. And I started thinking, well, why can't I get, why isn't the idea of a Black woman not available to me through this system, right? And the conclusion I've come to is that the data set that it's using doesn't have enough images of Black women in it to reconstruct an image of a Black woman. Now, this was done maybe 2.5 years ago, and things have changed a lot. And actually, there's a system that is much more advanced, but it's still not perfect, right? Here's another similar set. So I do these as kind of experiments. So this one was made on Google Colab, which is another site that you can all go to and play with these algorithmic systems and see how they work and start to form your ideas about how code is put together and how data is impacting that code, and how you might change it. Like, my question is always, well, how might I change it to get better results for the communities that I'm concerned about? And then how do I funnel that back into our general data, right? But this one, I said an African-American woman smiling. This is the image I got back, and you can see it's a little better. It's closer to the idea of what an African-American woman smiling might look like. I'm interested in the time that it exudes, because for me, it exudes this kind of 60s, 70s, 80s portraiture. And then if you look at these images, you can see these are some of the images that it's starting to pull to make that final image. This one is the final image. And these are some of the images that it was pulling and then smushing together to try to come to that image. And you can see the morphology. And the way that this works is that the algorithm pulls images from a data set, as many as it can, and I think I ran 1,000 iterations on these, and so it goes through 1,000 iterations trying to make an image of an African-American woman smiling from the information it has at its disposal. For argument's sake, this is a dark-skinned African-American woman smiling. I tried dark-skinned African-American woman because I tried a dark-skinned Black woman, and it was a worse image than this one. And I was trying to give the system a chance to come up with something that seemed viable, but this is where it was. And this is about a year ago that I made this, right? So things are changing. And this, by comparison, well, these are the background images that it was pulling for this to make that image. You get one image of a kind of Black woman in there. And then this is a woman smiling. So I just tried a default to see what it would come up with. And it comes up with this kind of vaguely pinkish woman. And something that looks womanly as well, right? But you can tell these systems kind of still make things really gritty in lots of ways. But doing the experimentation to try to figure out what these systems can do, what kind of data informs them, and then in the long run, can I add back data to impact what is coming out of those systems, right? And that's the suite of images as they get shown in a gallery, just so you can see what they do. And so the question of what's love got to do with it, I think love has everything to do with it in terms of the way we think about how we are, who we are, and why we're using these technologies. Right now, we seem to use the technologies a lot to correct or streamline or be punitive. And I think it's really important that we're starting to think about, well, how do we use these systems to honor our stories, to do things that support and help us understand each other way more than they detract from, you know, provide definitions that are static and stereotypical. Like, how do we start to move that button? And my solution truly has been thinking now a lot about story and the idea of stories as our algorithms, because stories have been around for millennia. We've told them forever. And I think it's more important now than ever to tell our stories, you know, and shout them loudly and deeply and help others understand our stories. So I've embarked on this turn of making projects like Secret Garden, which is a interactive piece that lives both in an installation. So this is an installation space where things are projected and people could walk through and they hear stories of 6 women. And really they're the stories of women from, I imagined a slave girl to a girl in the future that we don't know yet, plus bits of family story woven in there to kind of get at how we stand on each other's shoulders and how we support them. And the piece, when people went through it, is really about, can you listen to my story? Like for you, it's about, can you listen to my story? Can you hear it and really be attentive to it? Even though it's hard to tell where it's coming from or who it's attached to, can you give into that story, hear it, and walk with it, really? And I'll give you this last bit of Secret Garden as it lives online. If you want to see this, you can go to secretgarden.stephaniedinkins.com, and you can cruise this piece on your own because it lives online and is open for anyone to kind of cruise through. And it's literally a garden that you, and this is me navigating, come into, and if you listen carefully, you'll start to hear stories. And as you hear stories, you kind of cruise through and find characters who, once you get to them, you'll hear a story
Small
clearly.
enclave of Black families live there too. Most live near each other on the edge of town, just on the right side of the train tracks. I grew up in that small remote exurb as my mother did, because this is the place my grandparents settled after their migration north. Most Black families in the areas lived in a place called the Flats. It was an 8-family complex of shotgun apartments. They were probably the closest thing to the projects in Tottenville. I learned years later it was the only place that would rent to my grandmother and her family.
And if you notice,
when they
the
arrived in
character
early
isn't talking,
1940s.
she's just there. And it's like, I think of it as a kind of benign confrontation,
Where do
right?
you think my intelligence comes from? Huh? It came from the wellspring of humanity. Nothing artificial about that now, is there? That very wellspring is as vast as it is deep and rich with all the accumulated knowledge and experiences, emotions and actions that every human being has had since the time before time.
And so
It has
that's
all
the piece, and I
accumulated.
will leave it there
One thing
with the
important
idea that our
needs to
stories
see.
are our
That
algorithms
is a
and the
lot of
encouragement
intelligence
that we
and
think about
imagination.
story
Then,
as data,
one day, presto,
and the
when
idea of sharing story as an important part of the process of informing the systems that we live amongst, and the idea of calling out those systems when we think we've seen something that is injurious or harmful or not what we expect it to be, and letting folks know that there's a problem. Thank you very much. And are there any questions?
Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was great. Do any of our attendees have a question? You can either use the raise your hand feature or the Q&A feature if you do not want to speak. Just let us know. I'll give you a few minutes. Let's see, Q&A. I don't see any questions. I was thoroughly engaged, so thank you so much for presenting for us this afternoon. Thank you everyone for joining us. Today's session will be available on the Stony Brook Admissions YouTube page, and I will conclude today's event. Thank you, Stephanie, so much. And
welcome.
thank you, Paula. Have a great afternoon.
Okay, you too. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.